November 1812. A quiet month of the War of 1812. Ha! November 1812. Perhaps the biggest news of the month was the re-election of President James Madison. However, Madison's margin of victory over his opponent, a dissident fellow Democratic Republican, DeWitt Clinton, was much narrower than his margin of victory in 1808. Madison received 128 electoral votes to Clinton's 89, the results indicative of the considerable opposition to the war throughout the U.S. By way of contrast, in 1808, Madison beat his opponent, Federalist Charles C. Pinckney, by 122 to 47 electoral votes. HMS Royal George was a 20-gun sloop operated by the British Provincial Marine, later by the Royal Navy, on Lake Ontario during the War of 1812. It was the flagship of the Provincial Marine. On October 1st, the Royal George, under command of Hugh Earl and crewed by 50 members of the Provincial Marine and 64 men of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, anchored off the Genesee River, to raid the port of Charlotte, New York, which is now a suburb of Rochester, New York. They captured the dismantled sloop Lady Murray and a revenue cutter, returning the next day to demand the riggings and masts, M-A-S-T-S, of the Lady Murray. Talk about nerve. It was the Provincial Marines' sole victory during the war. Fast forward to November 9th, when the Royal George is surprised near Lake Ontario's Bay of Quinte, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, by a small fleet of 7 American ships under command of Commodore Isaac Chauncey. The Royal George slips into the channel between the mainland and Amherst Island, and under cover of darkness makes her way safely home to Kingston Harbor. The next day, November 10th, the American fleet attacked Kingston Harbor in an attempt to capture the Royal George, burning a small commercial vessel during their approach. Batteries along the shore fired at the Americans, who returned the compliment, peppering the town of Kingston with round shot, but they were unable to capture the Royal George, which moved further into the harbor. Chauncey determined to try his luck again on the 11th, but an approaching November storm forced him to return to base at Sackett's Harbor. This was the only attack on Kingston during the War of 1812. Following a series of massacres in the Old Northwest, a punitive expedition was sent into Illinois Territory under the command of Major General Samuel Hopkins and Colonel William Russell of the 7th Infantry Regiment. On November 11th, a force under Hopkins' command, consisting of 3 regiments of Kentucky infantry, a company of regulars from the 7th Infantry under Major Zachary Taylor, plus some Indiana Rangers and some scouts, leave Vincennes, Indiana, on a punitive expedition against the Kickapoo, Winnebago, and Shawnee tribes. Reaching the site of the Battle of Tippecanoe, which had taken place on November the 7th, 1811, they discovered that the remains of some American soldiers killed in the battle had been dug up and scalped. On November 19th, the Army reached Prophetstown, which had been destroyed during the Battle of Tippecanoe, but had been partially rebuilt. Well, they destroyed it again. After destroying another nearby Winnebago village on Wildcat Creek, a scouting party was exploring the creek on November 21st when they were fired upon and fled, leaving behind the body of a dead soldier apparently named Dunn. The next day, November 22nd, a body of 60 Indiana Rangers was dispatched to retrieve their comrade's body. But what they found was Dunn's head on a pole, next to which stood a native warrior who taunted them. An unlucky 13 Rangers chased the taunting warrior, who led them into an ambush, where they were massacred. A traitor named Benoit Bessaillon was captured, but then burned at the stake, where a friend put him out of his misery by shooting him, while one of those who escaped kept spurring his horse to go faster, 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 which gave this engagement its historic name, Spur's defeat. It is also known as the Battle of Wildcat Creek. American losses were 17 dead, 3 wounded, and Hopkins resigned. Wikipedia states that on November 23rd, the Americans withdrew from eastern Canada. Funny, I didn't know they were there. Unless they are referring to the Battle of La Colle Mills, which I learned of from the 4G War at WordPress site. Under the urging of President Madison, Major General Henry Dearborn assembled an invasion force of between 5,000 to 6,000 men, arriving at Plattsburgh, New York, November the 10th, with the goal of crossing the nearby Canadian border to seize Montreal. Dearborn is not known for moving quickly, so it is not until November the 20th that he dispatches an advance party under Colonel Zebulon Pike. Zebulon Pike, discoverer of Pike's Peak, to seize a Canadian blockhouse at La Colle Mills. Pike's men drive off the 40 defenders, but are mistakenly attacked by an American militia unit, which thinks it is attacking the British defenders. While all this is going on, British Major Charles de Salaberry, a Francophone, organizes a counterattack and drives the Americans back across the border. No wonder they withdrew on November 23rd. As for de Salaberry, we will hear about him again. After the defeat at Queenston Heights and the resignation of Stephen von Rensselaer, Alexander Smythe, a brigadier general in the U.S. Army, assumed overall command. Smythe has gone down in history as something of a horse's ass. As an officer in the regular army, he refused to serve under Van Rensselaer or even talk to him face to face, which contributed to the American defeat at Queenston Heights. Smythe thought he knew better and will now show he didn't. After releasing some rather bombastic proclamations, Smith fiddled while a number of buildings on both sides of the Niagara River burned following an artillery duel across the Niagara River on November the 20th. At the American Fort Niagara, one of the gunners was Mrs. Fanny Doyle, whose husband, Andrew, a private in the 1st Artillery Regiment, had been captured at Queenston Heights. According to author Richard Feltoe, Mrs. Doyle came, quote, under heavy fire as she helped to load and fire a 6-pounder cannon that was mounted on the fort's mess house roof. End of quote. The offensive of the offensive general began during the early morning hours of November the 28th. Captain William King of the U.S. 13th Infantry Regiment led 150 soldiers from the 12th and 13th Regiments, augmented by 70 sailors under Lieutenant Samuel Angus. Objective: to destroy the battery at the Red House near Fort Erie, so that later the main U.S. invading force wouldn't have to face artillery. A second force of 200 men from the U.S. 14th Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Borsler crossed the Niagara River with the objective of destroying a bridge over Frenchman's Creek between Chippewa and Fort Erie, which would hinder the movement of British troops and prevent a counterattack against Smythe's main landing force. It was a good plan. It was. On paper. King's force landed under fire from the British defenders, men of the 49th Regiment under Lieutenant Thomas Lamont. The Americans were repulsed 3 times, but managed to outflank the British on their 4th attempt, capturing Lamont and dispersing his men. The attackers then spiked the British guns, set fire to the Red House, and returned to their boats. Unfortunately for the Americans, they became befuddled in the darkness of the moonless night and ended up splitting into 2 groups. The first group, led by Lieutenant Angus, reached the landing place and, assuming the King's men had already departed, took all the boats and left, leaving the second party, under Captain King, stranded on the Canadian shore. Finding and liberating 2 British boats, King sent half his men, plus his British prisoners, back across the river, but was himself captured, along with 30 of his men. Crossing the river, Borsler managed to lose 4 of his 11 boats, but was still able to land, opposed by 37 men of the 49th under Lieutenant J. Bartley. After driving off the men of the 49th, as well as militiamen from the Norfolk Militia, the Americans took possession of the bridge, only to find they had a problem. The tools they were to use in destroying the bridge were all in the 4 lost boats. Borsler dispatched Lieutenant John Waring and 8 men to wreck the bridge by hand. They managed to rip up 1/3 of the planking before Borsler heard that the British were coming. The British were coming from Fort Erie, and shuffled off to Buffalo, leaving Waring and his men stranded. According to Wikipedia, when General Smythe heard of the spikings of the guns at the Red House, he exclaimed, "Huzzah! Canada is ours! Canada is ours! Canada is ours! This will be a glorious day for the United States." Smythe then ordered a force of 350 men of the 14th Regiment under Colonel William H. Winder to evacuate Captain King and his men. Collecting Lieutenant Waring and his men, Winder landed, only to beat a hasty retreat when confronted by a force of 300 men under Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Bishop. Coming under fire from the British, Winder's force took some 28 casualties as they rode for home. The Wikipedia article on this engagement suggests the raid had achieved its objective in spiking the guns at the Red House, as an American force could now invade between Chippewa and Fort Erie without coming under artillery fire. But if this was a victory, it was a hollow triumph. With the British and Canadian forces on high alert, Smythe attempts to launch an invasion next day, November 29th, in a cold steady rain, but managed to load only 1,200 of his 3,000-man force into boats before calling it off. Smythe tries again on the 30th, planning a night attack, but dawn catches them still loading. So, rather than risk a daylight amphibious assault, Smythe calls the invasion off. Again! With his army on the verge of mutiny and his life in danger, Smythe returns home to Virginia, and 3 months later, his name is quietly dropped from U.S. Army rolls. Wikipedia lists the casualties of the engagement as follows: British and Canadian, 13 killed, 44 wounded, 34 captured. American, 24 killed, 55 wounded, 39 captured. However, Richard Feltoe in A Call to Arms, the 1812 invasion of Upper Canada, gives different casualty figures for both sides. He estimates the American dead at between 30 to 100. Thus ends the quiet month of November 1812, a month that sees action on Lake Ontario, massacre in the Old Northwest, and 2 attempted invasions of Canada. It also sees the re-election of President James Madison, that most unlikely of warmongers, albeit by a narrower margin, which reflects the country's divided support for the war, which isn't going well. If this is your first visit to 1812 Channel, my name is Warren and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. Each month, for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events. I will also review a book on the war. Did I miss anything today? Any errors? Then please let me know in the comments below. When the barrage lifts, cheers! Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pix here, that's PX here, while the music was Crusade by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod. I had a few more things to say, but my voice is done. When the barrage lifts, see ya.